tonight he is going to tell us how a process that he discovered, that he's learned, and what he's going to do is present some C's to improve your storytelling. So the title of the speech tonight is See Your Way to Storytelling. So Gary Besaga, See Your Way to Storytelling, Gary Besaga.
Imagine yourself at a party. You're standing there when suddenly somebody comes up and does something that you think, this would make such a great story. Now, I'm not going to guess what your friends are going to do. Leslie, your friends? But whatever it is, whatever your friends that you think would make a great story. So you think, I can't wait to go tell my friends this. So you go over and you tell your friend, Bob, I got to tell you about what just happened at this party. Oh, well, I guess you had to be there. Has anybody ever been in this situation? Yeah, let's be honest here, okay? We think we have this great story in our minds, but how do we present it such that it actually comes across to people? Well, what I found is there is actually a process that you can use. And I'm going to spend the next few minutes sharing a process. And in the next few minutes, you're going to pick up this process that's going to help you take a story that normally you would have to finish by saying you had to be there and turn it into a story people will actually listen to. It also will help you to take a story that's kind of lackluster and turn it into something that people might actually remember. Anybody want to hear that?
Yes.
Yes? Come on. Anybody want to hear that?
Yes.
Yes. There you go. That's what I'm talking about. So we're going to talk about how to write a story. I hope I don't have to convince you that stories are everywhere. If you look around in the speaking world, everybody tells you, use stories, use stories, use stories. Forbes magazine and all over the internet, and Toastmasters magazine. That's what everybody tells you. Just look, Toastmasters magazine. This is from Forbes magazine. This is from a well-known blog. Storytelling will be the biggest business skill in the next 5 years. But they don't tell you how. How do I tell a story? So that's what we're going to talk about. But first, let's start with a story. When I was in first grade, my teacher told us to make half a K. Now, I had no idea what half a K was, so I made a whole K. She didn't like it. I got in trouble. A bunch of us didn't know it either, so we all got in trouble a little bit. The end. Great story, right? You're going to go out and repeat that to all your friends, right? But let's be honest. Don't most stories start that way? You think about something that happened years ago, and you remember little bits and pieces of what happened. You certainly don't remember dialogue. You certainly don't remember what somebody said to somebody else. But as we'll see tonight, that's what makes a great story. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at some possible points that we can use, a process to turn that little skeleton story into a real story that people are going to remember. And there's several different points I'm going to talk about. They all conveniently begin with a C. We're going to talk about characters. We're going to talk about conflict. We're going to talk about carry-out. Talk about cure. And finally, we're going to talk about change. Now, we could talk for hours about these topics, and I'd be glad to talk to you at another later time. But we're just going to kind of skim the surface on each one right now. But I hope taking these down and taking them to heart will really help you to improve your own stories. So let's look at the first part, characters. Characters are the life of the story. I mean, everybody likes characters, don't they? We all like to meet people. Now, if you're an introvert like me, you don't actually like to meet people, as in walk up and say hi and shake their hands and stuff like that. And I remember your humorous speech. If you're an introvert, you don't actually like that. But we like to read books, don't we? We like to read about characters in books. We like to meet people. And that's what the characters can do in your story. They can really make people want to hear more, pull them into the story. Not only that, but the characters make your story unforgettable. Think back to when maybe you were in first grade. I know, Lee, you had a humorous speech about was it your first grade teacher? It was a very early teacher. You remember her very well. And I'll bet you can remember characters from your childhood, from the early days, that you can remember even to this day. Good characters are unforgettable. Anybody like Star Trek? Star Trek? Yeah, a few Trekkies here? Okay? Yeah, there you go. Live long and prosper. Captain Kirk is an awesome character because we get to see the bravado side of him and we get to see the self-doubting side of him. Star Trek has awesome characters and they're unforgettable. Characters also need to be seen, known, and heard. And this is probably the first process thing that you can remember about characters. When you have characters in a story, they need to be seen, known, and heard. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, they need to be able to be seen. So in other words, we have to be able to picture them. You don't have to go into great detail about what they look like. You don't have to talk about exactly what kind of shirt they're wearing and all this kind of stuff. But just a hint of what they look like. Because that will help us to remember that character in our mind. They also need to be known. So in other words, we need to know something about them. If you're going to tell a story about a character, if that character is going to be important in your story, shouldn't we know something about them? Just like real people, we want to know something about them. And finally, heard. And this is one of the most important parts of storytelling I could possibly give you. We need to hear from the characters. Don't just talk about them. We need to hear what they said. Like in my case, in the example of my half a K story. Sister Thomas Marguerite. I don't just say she told us to make half a K and we got in trouble. We say, now class, I want you to make half a K. Let them be heard. Very important. I have one story that I'm working on right now. There's only 3 characters in the story, and I'm one of them. One character is only in the story for 2 sentences. But even in those 2 sentences, he has 1 line of dialogue. So every important character in your story should be heard. They should have dialogue. So that's characters. We move on to conflict. Conflict is very important in any kind of a story. It's the hook of the story. It's what grabs you and pulls you in and keeps you hooked, possibly for a long time. Has anybody ever picked up a book at 9 o'clock in the evening and look up from the book 5 minutes later and it's 3 a.m.? That's what conflict does. It pulls you in and it keeps you hooked into the story. Conflict also is key to the story. If there's no conflict, there's no story. Anybody here would admit to watching Real Housewives? Okay, girlfriends or wives? There you go, Steve. There you go. Okay, we can claim that, exactly. Who would watch Real Housewives if it wasn't for the constant conflict? You know, I asked my wife, why do you want to watch a TV show with a bunch of women who all hate each other? I don't know, but that's the conflict. That's what people want to listen to. And finally, the best stories don't just put the conflict out there. They escalate it. Think about Rocky. Rocky didn't just go in front of Apollo Creed for his big boxing match. He started at the beginning. He was down and out, former boxer. He went around breaking people's thumbs for a loan shark. Well, he wanted to get back into boxing, but all his friends were opposing him, so he had conflict. But he pushed through it, and then the people at the gym opposed him, so he had more conflict. And then Apollo Creed came into the town, and Adrian came around. Conflict, built. And you're just going, what's going to happen? Tell me the result of all this conflict. That's what a good story has. Build up that conflict as you go along. And I guarantee you, people will be sitting there thinking, something's got to happen. What's going to happen? They'll be totally drawn in by it. So escalate the conflict. Don't just leave it there. The third C, we talked about characters, We talked about conflict. We move on to the third C, which is the carry-out. This is quite literally the carry-out, the thing that your listeners will carry out. I call it the moral of the story here. Why do we speak? Why do we speak in public? It's fun. Okay, it's fun. But I think most of us would say that we speak because we want to change somebody. We want to change somebody's lives, or even if it's our own lives. We speak for a higher purpose. The storyteller, professional storyteller, Elizabeth Ellis, I took a workshop with her about 6 months ago. And one of the things she told us is, in a good story, you touch the person's emotions for the moment, and you touch their lives for years. And that's what the carry-out message can do. They can carry it out with them, they can take it with them, it can keep changing their lives. A key part of the carry-out is what is sometimes called the foundational phrase. This is a short phrase, less than 10 words if possible, that really sums up your message. I'll give you a couple of examples. In my speech at the International Speech Contest this spring, I had a speech that was related to self-defense for women. And I had a key phrase in there, foundational phrase. And it was, your intuition is your ammunition. Short, memorable, kind of rhymed. That's something that people could carry out with them and take with them. So the foundational phrase, very important. And finally, the thing that the foundational phrase lets you do is it lets you mold your story. In every story that we tell, there's a lot of details. You know, in my story about half a K with my first grade teacher, I could talk about the chalkboard, and I could talk about what Bobby Kennedy was telling me, and I could tell what Jeff Curtis said after school. But all those details, the story could go 15 or 20 minutes. So what the foundational phrase lets you do is it lets you trim down the story to just the important parts. And if there's anything that doesn't support the foundational phrase, toss it. Not for good. Not for good. You can tell another story later that uses the same information. But it doesn't belong in that story. So, foundational phrase, very important. So we've talked so far about the characters and the conflict and the carry-out. We move on to the cure. The cure is, this is how you found out how to resolve the conflict. You don't want to leave people hanging. You want to be able to resolve the conflict. And the cure is important because it shows the new way. If you want people to learn something, if you want to change people's lives, they have to learn a new way from you. And the cure shows them what that new way is. If you're giving a talk on, like mine in the spring, on self-defense, what I wanted women to know is, don't ignore your intuition. Your intuition is your ammunition. And that was the result of the conflict, and that's the new way that they could say, yes, I can listen to my intuition. And finally, when you're coming up with the cure, please find a guru that's not you. It's very easy to say, to give a story. I was walking along and suddenly something came to my mind, and no, try to give somebody else that honor. So we have characters, we have conflict, we have carry-out, we have cure, and finally we have the change. This is how the new way affects the characters in the story. The change is very important to bring across because this is what really sells your point. Because people will say, yes, that's right. If I take his carry-out message, it helped him, so maybe it'll help me too. So showing the change is a really important part of the story as well. And finally, it ties up loose ends. You don't want to leave stuff hanging out there that people may wonder, whatever happened to that guy? Finish it in the change. So this is the process here. Characters, conflict, carry-out, cure, change. There's lots more information here on CraigValentine.com. This is, I have a website here, story.expert. This is my website. It's very, very bare bones at the moment, but I'll be putting more information out there. One of the things it's got on it is it's got a link to my half a K story, so you can see what that story about my first grade teacher really looks like when it's told as a real story. And soon there'll be a course on Udemy that I'm putting together, which is an online course where I'll make sure that everybody gets a free coupon for it. So with that, let's apply the process. We'll improve our stories, we'll make them more memorable, and we can go out and really change people's lives. So.
Thank you, Gary.